The reinforcements arrive a few days later. And on the 12th, this is an interesting story. On the 12th of July, during a skirmish, there was a junior officer named Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He's going to have a big future. Many of our listeners will know he goes on to become one of the most famous Supreme Court justices. But at this time, he's just a young lieutenant or captain. And he's in the defenses of Washington, and he sees a civilian, big tall guy with a big high hat. And this civilian is standing up in the midst of incoming Confederate fire. And he shouts to this man, he says, "Get down, you damn fool, before you get shot." And the civilian was none other than Abraham Lincoln himself. I love this story.
These are different times when it comes to the safety of a president.
I know, man. He's just nuts. Lincoln, do you have a death wish? Lincoln had ridden out to see the fighting. And by the way, Lincoln did get down. He followed the order. So who knows what would have happened if he didn't. But he did. And Lincoln's going to survive at least a little longer. So General Early is not insane. He realizes he didn't have the strength to attack Washington. So he retreats back to the Shenandoah Valley. But it was a masterful campaign. He had accomplished all the goals Lee had set for him. He'd swept the Federal Army completely out of the valley. He'd threatened Washington. He'd given Lincoln a heart attack, not literally, of course, but almost caused Lincoln to get shot. So Grant realizes, okay, I need a real commander to go up there and get rid of General Early. So he sends Philip Sheridan up with 50,000 men. This is September now. And Sheridan repeatedly defeats Early. He pushes him back up the valley. And again, up the valley means going south. All the while, Sheridan is burning crops, killing livestock. General Sherman would have been proud. Did I say Sherman? I might have even said Sherman. This is Sheridan, not Sherman. They sound alike, but they're acting alike here as well. And the valley was so devastated by the Union troops under General Sheridan that Sheridan wrote, "A crow will have to carry its own rations if it flies across the valley." So there's not even enough for a crow to eat. So the valley is no longer a source of supply for the Confederacy. No more breadbasket of the Confederacy.
This is a tactic we see over and over again, where it almost seems as crucial to attack a supply line than it does to attack the army itself with, reasonable strategic importance, because as we see that can cripple the army. And this is what Grant is trying to do right now to get in between Lee and Richmond. So what's happening now if we go back to our friend Grant?
All right. So Grant, yes, as you mentioned, he's continually trying to find a way to get between Lee and Richmond, to cut off his supplies and to prevent him from linking up with Joseph Johnston's army, which is now in North Carolina. Grant keeps on lengthening his lines. He just spreads it out further and further. And this forces Lee, of course, to do the same, because when your opponent moves, let's say they move the far left of their force a mile to a mile further, you've got to also move yours. You can't let them get around you. Lee's line reaches 35 miles in length, but that makes it very, very thin. And up to 100 Confederate soldiers were deserting per day during the winter of 1864 and 1865. Desertion is a major problem with starvation. A lot of these soldiers are getting letters from their home. There's a letter that I read to my classes, and maybe I'll read it right now. I got it out of Professor Gary Gallagher's lecture series on the Civil War, which we'll talk about more later. But these men are just getting these heart-wrenching letters from home saying, "Come home or we're going to starve if you don't come home." I won't read the letter, but that's the basic idea. And on March 25th, Lee tried to break through the Federal lines. Lee gets aggressive again. He's tired of just sitting there and being attacked. He wants to do some attacking of his own. He attacks Fort Stedman, which is part of the Union line. The Confederate attack there at first works, but after Grant sent reinforcements, the Federals drove back the rebels and even captured part of their line. Lee loses 5,000 men. So again, maybe not the best idea. Lee's a little over-aggressive here, as he sometimes was. Moving into April now. This is 1865, April of 1865. Grant launches a major attack against Lee's right flank, and the attack is at Five Forks. It's led by General Sheridan, who we just talked about, who defeated Early in the Valley earlier. General Sheridan leads this force. He routs the Confederates and he inflicts another 5,000 casualties to only 1,000 Union ones. So things are starting to gradually move in the Union's direction. The next day, Grant attacked across the entire Confederate line. Another 5,000 rebels fell. And Lee realizes, I can't hold this line anymore. So he pulls out of Petersburg and he retreats westward. So the siege is finally broken after several months. At this point, Lee only has 35,000 troops. He had had 60,000 when Grant first attacked almost a year earlier. This has been going on a year. I need to make sure everybody understands that. We skipped over several months because not much happened. But the first attack, when Grant first hit Lee, it was in early May of 1864. Now it's April of 65. All right, so Lee's down to 35,000 troops, as I mentioned. He hoped to meet a supply train and then join his force with the forces of Joseph Johnston, combine the forces, and then hit back. Lee realizes, though, that Richmond has got to be abandoned. So he sends a message to Jefferson Davis telling him, Richmond, you've got to get out of there. I can't hold Richmond anymore. Davis had actually been in church. This is a Sunday. He'd been in a service at the Episcopal Church there, and somebody brought him a note from Lee, and as soon as he read the note, he left the service and got ready to evacuate. So the Confederates burned everything in Richmond of military value, and the members of the Confederate government boarded a train and got the heck out of there. So Richmond finally, after almost 4 years, Richmond finally falls into federal hands. Lincoln actually wanted to see Richmond. He visited the city on April 4th. And he was mobbed by former slaves. These slaves had just become free. They hailed him as their savior. They called him Father Abraham. Yeah. And at one point, Lincoln says, I want to sit down at Jefferson Davis's desk. I want to see what it was like to be Jefferson Davis. So he does. It's kind of a funny thing.
I read about this account where he comes into the city, and there are some very stony-faced Southerners who are still in watching Lincoln come along.
Yeah, they were not happy to see him, but certainly the slaves were, or the former slaves now. Lee and his army are moving west, and as they do so, the Federals pursue them. They follow them. You know how we've seen so many times where there was a Union victory, but the Union army did not follow up. They didn't pursue. Well, Grant doesn't work that way. Grant does follow them. Sheridan's army was to the south, preventing Lee from turning that way. So much for going to North Carolina and linking up with Johnston. Hundreds of Confederate soldiers, famished, exhausted, and just demoralized and ready. They're done. They fall by the wayside. Others just throw away their weapons and they continue. They're so weak they can't even carry their rifles. On April 6th, parts of the armies collided at Sailor's Creek, and another 7,000 Confederates were captured. So the army is just disintegrating. Lee doesn't. In fact, he says that. He turns to a staff officer and he exclaims, "My God, has this army been dissolved?" By April 8th, Sheridan got in front of Lee's army and captured the Confederate rations. So those supplies and the food that Lee was hoping to get, gone. That's it.
And this campaign goes on a long time, so keep in mind what we talked about in earlier episodes of the fall of Atlanta, Sherman's march to the sea. Bragg's army has dissolved. Lincoln is reelected. Lee's army is essentially dissolved. Is there any major Confederate force still out there?
It depends on how you define major, but not like you used to have. You certainly don't have any armies of 60,000 or 50,000 or 80,000, nothing like that. You've just got a few thousand under Johnston in North Carolina, and then you've got these few thousand under Lee, and just a handful in the West, but no major gigantic armies like you had in 1861 through 63, 64.
All right. Well, it looks like we're all of this just rapidly is with the Army of Northern Virginia essentially dissolved. This is really coming to an end. So this basically takes us to Appomattox, doesn't it?
It really does. Things unravel for the Confederates very quickly after April of 64, or March, April. Grant sends a letter to Lee, and in his letter he says this. This is kind of a long quote, but I think it's worth quoting in full. He says, "The results of the last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate Southern Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. In other words, Grant is telling Lee, it's hopeless. Give it up. I'm paraphrasing there. And upon reading this, Lee tells an aide, he says, there's nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths. So he writes Grant asking for terms of surrender. And the two commanders agree to meet, and they meet in the parlor of a home that is owned by a man named Wilmer McLean. And our listeners, if you've been with us all along,
the circle is complete, our friends.
The circle is complete. That is right. Wilmer McLean was the man who had a shell go through his house at the first Battle of Bull Run. And he said, man, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to go somewhere far from the war where I will never have to have armies, soldiers or generals or anybody in my house again. Well, sorry about that. He later said after the war that the army began in my front yard. The war began in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. Just another one of those great stories. So Lee shows up first. He's immaculately dressed in his best uniform with a sword. He thought he was going to become a prisoner. Grant shows up in a shabby uniform. This is so typical, covered with mud. Grant really wasn't much on appearances. He didn't go for the fancy uniforms and all that.
He had a few sips of whiskey beforehand, probably.
He might have, yeah. And he wasn't trying to insult Lee. The reason he was covered with mud is actually because he tried to hurry. He'd ridden really fast to get there. He didn't want to make Lee wait. He respected Lee, really did. So it's a very contrasting picture between the old Southern gentleman immaculately dressed, and here's this basically a Northwesterner, just looking like crud. But anyway, they two sat down. They made small talk. And can you imagine how awkward it must have been? It's like, so
where are you from?
Grant mentioned that he remembered Lee from the Mexican War. Lee could not remember Grant. At least didn't remember. It's like, awkward. But anyway, so they finally get down to business, and Grant offered very generous terms. None of this, it's not like we're taking you all prisoner, you're all going to be executed, you're going to be put in jail, nothing like that. Very generous. The Southerners they'd get to keep their horses because they had supplied them themselves. In the Confederate Army, you had to bring your own horse. You didn't get issued a horse by the Army. Officers got to keep their sidearms. And he also sent 25,000 rations to the Confederates. So he feeds the army that he had just been fighting days before. And all the Confederates would be paroled, which means they're sent home on the agreement that they'll never fight again. And at this point, almost all the Confederates said, no, I don't ever want to fight again. I'm perfectly happy with that. Afterward, Lee told his soldiers, he said, boys, I've done the best I could for you. Go home now, and if you make as good citizens as you have soldiers, you will do well. And he's in tears, and the Confederate Army is in tears. Grant later wrote that he was sad and depressed at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though the cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which people ever fought. So again, Grant's throwing respect toward Lee, but not for the cause that he fought for. But for Lee as a person and as a commander, Grant had the ultimate in respect. The formal surrender doesn't occur until April 12th, and Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the man that we mentioned, he was one of the Union heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg, day 2 at least. He's now a general. He receives the Confederate surrender. The Union troops offered a gesture of salute to their vanquished foes. How's that for respect? They saluted them. And the Army of Northern Virginia is now gone. It no longer exists. So Lee's out of the picture. The entire Army of Northern Virginia, and essentially, for all intents and purposes, this ends the war, although there's still a little bit of cleanup that needs to be done.
Right. There's still some forces out in the West, aren't there?
Yeah. Well, even in North Carolina, you still had Joseph Johnston. He had 30,000 soldiers by this point. He surrenders to Sherman on April 26th. On May 4th, General Richard Taylor surrendered the main Western Confederate Army, so they're out in the west part of the Confederacy. On May 11th, Jefferson Davis and other